Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reading the Room, a podcast in which I am joined by a bookish guest to talk about something bookish. And today I am so excited to be joined by Kayla Maiuri, author of the debut novel, Mother in the Dark, which I was just telling Kayla, this has been one of the longest anticipated books that I've ever, been awaiting release since I met Kayla on TikTok like 2 years ago. So this has been really exciting to finally read it and get to talk to you for the first time. So thank you so much, Kayla, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the meat of the book, can you give us a brief synopsis of what your book is about?
The novel is about a young woman living in New York City, and she's going through this really lonely, sort of depressive time in her life, and she's estranged from her family, and she gets a phone call from her sister, and she just sort of instinctually knows that it's about their mother and that something is wrong, and so she doesn't return the phone call. And then the narrative sort of dips into the past, back and forth between past and present, and you see what went wrong in her childhood to cause this fraught relationship.
It was really interesting seeing how, like, the influences that I know you love, like in the books that you recommend, seeing kind of how that bleeds into your own writing style. And so I wanted to ask you about how tightly composed this book is, but also quite lyrical in its descriptions. And I'm wondering for you, like, does your writing start with an image or an idea or language or character or all of those things? I'm just wondering how you start putting pen to page.
An image. The earliest draft of this novel is just a notebook filled with inconsequential scenes of the girls and the mother sitting on the front porch or in the living room, in the kitchen, at the table, and they're just talking and eating and being sassy to each other. Really nothing is happening. It's just a lot of mood and atmosphere. Then I eventually stitched them all together. I do remember the first scene that I wrote, which was when Diana is in the living room in the middle of the night and Anna's home alone with her, and she comes downstairs and she can see that something's clearly wrong, and she knows also that her father's been out drinking. She's worried because he has to drive home under the influence to get home. Anna's asks her mother what's wrong, what's going on, and her mother tells her that Anna needs to be the one to call her father because he doesn't listen to her. He laughs in her face when she says that he has a drinking problem. So it was this like role reversal between mother and daughter, and daughter as caretaker, that I really wanted to get across. So that was the first real like cemented scene, but the rest were just images of Diana in her nightgown.
I loved, being so immersed in this book. I find, like, when I picked it up, I was immediately placed in every scene, and it just felt so tangible, everything that you were describing. So I just want to commend you for how you're able to craft this, and how I feel like Anna and all of the characters are so true and real through your description. I think it's so important to kind of evoke that sense of putting the reader in the seat of these characters, which is really, really well done. I mean, aside from that, going to the setting of this being set in Massachusetts, I was born in Massachusetts, and I think you do a really great job of placing Anna both in Massachusetts and New York in the different timelines of the novel. So I'm wondering how you approached sort of evoking Massachusetts in this book.
Well, first of all, with Massachusetts, I was really, there's that sort of Boston vibe that everyone's aware of, which is that no nonsense attitude, sort of sarcastic, like rough around the edges crassness that I wanted Diana to have. And I guess that's not really setting, that's more atmosphere. The Massachusetts scenes. So I started the novel when I had moved to New York, and it's been brought to my attention in like several interviews now that the novel has a lot of weather and natural world descriptions. And I'm not a nature girl, so it's kind of funny that this is what ended up coming through in the book. And I think what you're witnessing is what the reader is witnessing is me as the writer actively being nostalgic for home and writing about my childhood. And because it's impossible to think about Massachusetts without thinking about the fall, first of all, and my mother like sitting on the front porch rolling pine cones and peanut butter and seeds and feeding them to the birds, and the turkeys in the backyard that are so ugly and hideous. They just like sunbathe in the backyard. So I just was sort of, I think, missing home, and so really maybe that's why it's come through so strongly in the pages. And I think being away from home and having that distance helped. I don't know that I could have written about Massachusetts while I was in Massachusetts. And the New York scenes, I was just looking out my window and pretty much writing about the things that I was feeling as a young 22-year-old in New York.
That's interesting to hear. And I mean, you also, I think, like you mentioned, talking about Boston and tied with atmosphere is very keen to also describing what Boston is, I think, too, and like evoking that in the page and just going to atmosphere in this book. As the title suggests, it's called Mother in the Dark. And I found there's so much darkness in this book, which is something that I, as a reader, am thematically very drawn to. I wanted to ask you about horror generally and if that is like an influence on you in your work, because there's this one scene with Diana. There's a couple scenes, but this one I wrote down because I was like, dude, that's very creepy description, which I liked. But the sisters are all watching Diana out of their window, and she's standing in the yard, and the quote is, "She was mumbling unintelligible words, marble-mouthed, gripping her hair. I wouldn't have been surprised if she slipped into the forest on all fours to scour the soil and rocks." And that was just such a just stark image in my mind. And so I'm just wondering how you conjure up those dark scenes.
I guess so. I'm not into like body horror or like real violence, but I do love to be terrified and like with like psychological thrillers. I'm really intrigued by the grotesque, and it just seemed really grotesque for me for her to be crawling on all fours on the rocks and with mud and dirt, but the moonlight spraying on her. There are a couple of like really disturbing images, like the ants and the cereal, which I regret to say happened in real life. Um, and also the scene where Anna leaves the windows open, the screens, they're screenless windows, and then she wakes up in the middle of the night and the room is covered in bugs, which is also something that happened to me once. Yeah, that I love to be disturbed in novels. My favorite novels are like the bleakest, darkest, most uncomfortable. I never thought of myself as being influenced by horror, but I guess the horror and the grotesque, yeah.
There's definitely some, like, in your recommendations, as I mentioned, like on TikTok and stuff that I saw. I mean, there are a lot of books that I love too. I have a question for you about, the sisters in this novel and their dynamic. It reminded me of Sisters by Daisy Johnson, which is a book that I think plays with the sort of burden and horror of certain family dynamics in a really interesting way that I think your book touches on too in a similar way. So I'm wondering how you crafted the sister dynamic in this book as well.
So I initially had only began the novel with one sister because it's kind of something you're taught in workshop is to not have too many characters that don't have a role. But I am the eldest of three, and I think that the dynamics between like an odd number of siblings are so like there's so much room for like drumming up drama when there's an unequal amount of siblings. There's always shifting alliances and loyalties and betrayals. So I knew that I wanted to play with power dynamics and what it was like to be in an odd number of three, but also I thought that it would be more like most powerful if Diana had three daughters teaming up against her, because it's just that's heartbreaking, or becomes heartbreaking the way that they make her like the butt of every joke, and she just sort of like falls into that role. And she's also kind of like a fourth sister, which is something that I was trying to get across. Also with the sisters, I'm really fascinated by the ways that sibling like the recovery mode for siblings when they get in a fight and then 5 minutes later are like hugging and giggling and having fun together. So I was really trying to manage that balance between this really beautiful unconditional love, but also these people have the ability, they know exactly how to hurt you. Like my sisters can make me cry in 2 seconds and they know it. I love them, and for the most part they're sweet. But so yeah, I've always been fascinated by siblings in literature as well, and Daisy Johnson's novel is one that comes to mind, as well as Housekeeping. Marilyn Robinson. I don't know if you've read that.
I have not. I have like four of her books that I have not read yet, but I need to. She's on like my fall TBR of
I
reading.
can
So
really picture you loving Housekeeping just based on all of your taste. Very quiet novel about the absence of a mother, basically, and a really fraught sister relationship.
definitely will be reading that then. Yeah, that's really interesting hearing you talk about how you sort of describe the sisters in this book from your own experience. And I myself am an only child, and I've seen that dynamic that you talk about, how like I've hung out with siblings and I can see them, they start bickering and then instantly like they forget about it and they're just like best friends again. And it's just kind of like part of their rapport. And I just have never had that myself, but I think it's fascinating and I think it comes through really well. I mean, there's one scene near the end of this book in which I don't want to get too far into spoilers, but Anna and Leah are talking about Anna's choice to go to New York and how Leah sort of feels betrayed by her making that decision, but how they're able to sort of work through that conversation and those feelings with each other was really poignant and just really interesting. And I think it was really beautifully done. All I have to say, yeah, it's just something that I'm not personally familiar with, but I love reading about it in fiction and like books about motherhood generally. Like one of my favorite books ever is Motherhood by Sheila Heti, which is more so about like the decision or not to be a parent and how that structures your life.
I can't believe I've not read that book. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing writing a novel about mothers and daughters, having never read that novel, but it's also on my list. And I know that you've recommended it a million times, so it's on there. I need to read it.
I think you'll dig it. It's like deeply, deeply philosophical, which I've been really drawn to as well. So yeah, I would love to know your thoughts on it when you read it. So that book's quite plotless, I would say, and this one does have plot in it. And I'm wondering about how you structured
So
this book.
satisfying to hear you say that because the plot was so difficult. Does not come easily to me. Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh no, you're good. No, I mean, I think one thing that I love in books or in film is when there's, a missed call and wondering what the urgency is at the end of that call and sort of keeping a blind eye to what is the truth behind a situation. And I think that is the core of this book is in terms of plot is how Anna is thinking about what happened to her mom and how she's trying to avoid the reality of that situation. And you don't really know till the end of the book what happens there. And so I'm wondering this idea of having Anna sort of avoid these phone calls. How do you come to that as the sort of plot device to build suspense?
It came later. It was definitely something that we like tacked on at the end exactly to do that, to create suspense. Because in those New York scenes, I had Anna sort of like bumbling around, repeating the same behaviors that her mother was repeating in her childhood and being really self-sabotaging and depressive and self-victimizing. Those scenes were, yeah, displaying all of that. And then also, I guess more to that sort of horror, grotesque element. She was seeing like specters of her mother in people on the street or in cafes or on the subway, being haunted by her. But I was like, still, like, how am I going to get this girl home? Like, what is the point of this? And then I was like, oh, maybe she gets a phone call from her sister. So it really is working as a plot device in that way, but also just revealing so much about Anna's personality and her character, like her, because she's not calling home because she's fearful of what she'll hear on the other end of the line, but also she's really angry at her mother, which is like very apparent from the beginning. Also feeling really ashamed of the way that she left her family. So that phone call is working as a plot device, but also hopefully evoking a lot through Anna's lack of action with the phone call.
A really good point, and also interesting how like through the character of Vera, who is her best friend, who we learn more about has they have a longer friendship that we learn more about throughout the novel, but also thinking about that sort of subplot in the New York sections of the novel and the sort of, for lack of a better word, messiness that ensues with their friendship that kind of plays into the final act of the novel. I'm wondering how, in terms of Anna being on her own later or in the present tense of the book versus the sister dynamic that she grows up with, that we see both of those things playing together. And I'm wondering how you created Vera and wanting to use her or what your goal is with using her as sort of like a foil maybe to the sisters. I thought it was really interesting seeing that difference there and how Anna behaves in relation to her as a friend.
Yeah, Vera was useful to me in a couple of ways. So as a child, she's really sort of like monstrous and a little bit manipulative and not a very good friend. But then she grows up into this really thoughtful, beautiful friend. And I wanted to show how Anna's growth has sort of been stunted because in childhood she was the shy, like little, I don't know, for the most part, pleasant to be around young girl. And then she becomes really territorial and there's a serious, lack of boundaries and lack of communication. And she sort of, I don't know that she takes advantage of Vera, but she tries to control her life. And these are things that we could definitely imagine Diana doing. So I wanted to show, I guess Vera's also, I'm just realizing, sort of mirroring the relationship between Debbie and Diana in those early sections of the novel. Oh, and I suppose Anna is treating Vera the way that she treats her sisters and that she expects her to always be there and as if she can treat her anyway and she won't leave. But primarily I think Vera is acting as like a surrogate mother to Anna because Anna flees her mother, but she is seeking her mother everywhere, which is the ironic part. Like she is craving her mother's love. Vera is the one who will crawl into bed with her and cradle her as she's crying and coddle her and make sure that she's okay. And Anna expects this of her. And then there's also the scene where Vera is washing the dishes in their apartment and Anna is reminded of a memory of her own mother washing the dishes, and she sort of just places that image of her mother on top of Vera, and it's like as if they're becoming the same person. So that was a really roundabout way of saying that I think Vera is doing a few things for me as a writer.
Yeah, she's really, I think, critical to this book, and also in the sense of like how she really holds Anna accountable, especially by the end of the book in terms of what she like sees through Anna's, sorry, like a better word, bullshit, I guess, in terms of what she's doing and like avoiding the reality situation and really telling her like you need to figure out what's going on here. Because it also boils up into Vera's life and how Anna's behaving towards her, which I'll leave as a reveal for the reader. Yeah, I mean, I think she's really critical here, and I love books about female friendship as well. And also, what I love so much about the structure here of how you go back and forth between time, I mean, it goes in the past to Anna's childhood, and then it's also the present, and you actually switch tenses in the writing, which helps ground the reader in each section, which was helpful, but also I think interesting seeing you explore both tenses in one book, which was fun. But I mean, this book is quite character driven, and one character that the, I guess, title might not lead you to think it would be a lot about, but it is a lot about the father here as well, and their relationship and his behavior with Diana and his daughters and his own problems. And so I'm wondering how you fit the father in the book.
You're the first person to ask about the father. And he was one of my favorite characters to write. I guess he sort of gets lost in the mix. With the father, I'm trying to address this lifelong question that I myself have had, which is why do we, as daughters, but really just as people, blame our mothers and forgive our fathers? There are moments where the father objectively makes terrible decisions that put his family in harm's way, and still Anna is like, nope, that's not dad's fault, that's mom's fault. I think it just has something to do. I think society has trained us to treat our mothers this way and to expect too much of them, to expect them to be self-neglecting and self-sacrificing in a way that men or fathers are not. And that's not to say, I mean, Vin is breaking his back to provide for his family, and that's it. He's providing for his family in a very tangible way, whereas Diana, though she's like not too great at it, she is providing in more invisible ways. And she's very underappreciated. So, I mean, poor Vin, I guess that's what he was meant for, was just to sort of explore that dynamic and that question I've had all my life. Yeah.
That's so surprising hearing, I guess, a lack of questions about him because I felt he was such a complex character that really added so much and raised a lot of interesting questions here, particularly to me about like this idea of familial duty between all parties in this family and how the sort of expectations that are placed on each other and what like should, whether it be the parents or the daughters, like what do they truly owe each other at the end of the day and what is expected of them and how do those things sort of flounder in certain situations and how that all kind of comes together to build this family unit that still at the end of the day is intact and they all love each other so much. And so I just loved, I guess all I had to say, I loved how complex he is as a character that sort of reflects the more deeper complexities of the other characters. So all I had to say, I think he's just so important to this book, and I loved reading about him as well. And I'm curious to know, in terms of all these moving parts, it seems like I'm just so fascinated by writers and how you're able to create this final, work of art. And so I'm wondering, like, for revision and this being your debut, can you talk about like the actual craft of this and how it became the final product that is Mother in the Dark?
The biggest revision that like really changed the entire novel is that Vera used to be, or she began as a boyfriend. And I was 22 and I had never had a serious relationship, let alone lived with somebody that I was dating in a serious way. So it just was coming off as really inauthentic, and I didn't understand the nuances of that. But I had lived with plenty of female roommates, and I'm very aware of like the complicated female friendship. That was the biggest revision, and I think it was my agent who said, "Why don't we just pull that childhood Vera and make her come to New York with Anna, and we'll explore that adult friendship." And thank God she did. Other than that, I mean, so the novel began as a novel in stories, which I feel like is what a lot of young like MFA writers do. I was really inspired by Justin Torres's We the Animals and Susan Minot's Monkeys, as well as it's not really a novel in stories, but June Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies. And I just had to train myself how to write a novel. Really, I always say it was my agent who taught me how to write a novel. Because she forced me to delve deeper and to make every scene have intention and consequence. Well, the novel is 8 years old, but the actual editing process was probably 4 or 5 years old. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did know, absolutely. I'm just so curious to know, like, the time that it takes to build a debut novel, and I guess going off of that question of what you've learned from this process. I mean, do you have current, like, not to ask you about what your next work is going to be, but do you have like indications or thematic things that you're looking to explore next in your work?
In between selling my novel and publishing it, I went through a really traumatic breakup, and I wrote a novel in like 3 months, which is insane compared to my 8 year uh, saga with this one. And the process was so different. I mean, it's not there yet, and it definitely probably needs another year at least of revising. But I don't know that I've like taken anything with me. But that's what's so scary. It always feels like you're starting over. But in terms of themes, this is a relationship novel, but still, like Diana is like seeping in. Like I'm like, go away! I can't write about you forever, but I think I will continue to write about Diana, just in like a different form and different name. I'm still writing about sisters. Like I have these obsessions that I feel like are never going to go away. There's a female friendship drama in this one too. I mean, it's a very, very different novel.
No, I love that. I mean, those are such huge themes that it's probably hard to just erase them from future work. I mean, they're so big, and I would love to see you explore them again in a new context. So I'm curious to see how that plays out for you, and of course, we'll be reading it as soon as it comes out. One thing too that you just said something that reminded me of my discussion with Antonia Angris, who wrote Sirens and Muses, another debut novel that just came out. She was talking about how like each novel you embark on kind of reveals itself as you write it, at least for her and her experience. And then I'm wondering if that's true for you. Like, do you feel you hinted at this already, but does it feel like a completely new territory when you're writing, or do like the tools that you take from your MFA still kind of provide like a toolkit for you? It seems like it'd be so hard. So I'm just so fascinated. I don't know.
I still begin with images. I mean, emotion. I'm always that is the impetus for everything is how I'm feeling, and I want that to be what pulls the reader in. And I guess the difference is that I have the courage to just do what I want. Whereas I remember it took me probably 3 years to decide, okay, I'm going to switch between past and present. And not only that, but I'm also going to switch the tenses between past and present in Mother in the Dark. Whereas with this book, I was like, I'm going to jump through time and I'm going to just wait for the reader to catch up. Who knows? Maybe my agent will be like, no, Kayla, we're making this more chronological. But I think that's something that probably writers will take with them after their first novel is just the courage to do what feels right. Other than that, that blank page is still like just horrifying.
It sounds daunting, and aside from that too, I think you would. It's interesting hearing that this book started as a novel and stories, because I feel like your creative leanings and the way that you kind of lean into description. Some of my favorite short story collections feature writing that I feel like is so similar to yours as well. So, do you still like write short stories to this day, or is it not as common for you?
I've just never written a successful short story from beginning to middle to end. They're so hard. I admire people who can do it. I've no, everything I write has to be a novel. Because that's the reason I also wrote the novel because these were not good standalone stories. They really need to be explored in a sort of like more untethered way. And I guess that's what it is. I'm a little bit messy and I can't stay in that little like 20-page structure. Are short stories even 20 pages? I'm not sure. Um, but maybe one day. Flash fiction I can do.
Yeah, that seems even more difficult to me, but I don't know. Yeah, I love it all. So, I guess going to now that you have the book out, and I'm curious to know just about like your being a debut author in 2022, and how I discovered you is through TikTok. And I remember my friend CJ and we were looking for like literary fiction people on TikTok. And so we just looked up the hashtag literary fiction. You were like the first one to show up. And then I read your bio and it said, Mother in the Dark coming out from Riverhead Books, and I'm obsessed with Riverhead Books. I'm like, what? Who is this person? And so I was so excited. And then your taste was also impeccable, and there was so much overlap. So I guess my question about all of this is, how did you come to TikTok, and like, how do you feel about recommending books online and doing both things now with a published book?
I had a friend who was an influencer who was just like, "Hey, I feel like you should really like enter this medium. I think you could reach a lot of people." Um, and I was like, "Okay, that seems fun. I'll do." It was like 2020, so I had nothing better to do. But also, one of my greatest passions is really getting to know a person and understanding their obsessions and their tastes and recommending books to them. So it's been a lot of fun. But I don't read at this nearly as fast as I used to. And also just like I read less now that like the world has opened up again. So I feel like I've like gone through my bookshelf and it's really hard coming up with new content for TikTok. But it's also been really uplifting to see how many readers there are out there because I didn't know. I like really thought, okay, it's like the 20 lesson workshop and like all the other MFA programs, like no one's reading literary fiction. And even it is really hard to come across literary fiction people on TikTok. Being there has been a comfort to me because I know that people are reading literary fiction. I guess Bookstagram is also that way, although I'm not really a part of that. But I mean, overall, social media can be a little bit stressful. I think there is a pressure to like be self-promoting and I definitely get self-conscious about that and about like annoying people in my feed and even on TikTok. I'm like, people don't want to keep hearing about this. But I feel like I'm not doing my job if I'm not promoting it. So I love it some days and hate it other days.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting balance, I think, to walk, especially, as an author. And I've been recently, I read Elena Ferrante's book of nonfiction, and she, is completely off the grid in that front. And so just interesting seeing, like, the difference there and wondering kind of like the pressures from a writer, especially a debut writer, like what is placed on you for all that. But I think, of course, you're doing a great job. And it seems like from people that I follow, everyone's loving this and eating it up on TikTok and Bookstagram and everything. And so I guess the last segment of the podcast, I always love to ask for book recommendations. So I'm so stoked for this, given how I discovered you. So I'm just wondering, like, I know you said you're reading less as of late, but are there any recent reads that you've really enjoyed?
I feel like a broken record because I keep recommending the same book over and over, but it's because it's the last book that I read, which I'm pretty sure you and I also spoke about, which was Anna Hoagland's The Long Answer. It's just a quiet, beautiful novel about female friendship and sisterhood, and it plays beautifully with structure. She's a person who was super brave and I mean, it seems just writing in this experimental way, even though it probably would have been frowned upon in a workshop. And I don't, have you read the novel?
No, so I have it here. It's actually my next book I need to read because she's coming on the podcast next week. So I have
Oh,
to read it
yay.
this week. Yeah, I'm so
I loved it
stoked.
so much. I loved it. And I mean, this is from not this year, but just I still am thinking about Aishul Shabaz's White on White. I don't know if you read this one.
Yes, I loved it.
Yeah, just another like philosophical, but just like so quiet, just female friendship novel. I feel like I need to reread it. And then I know it's so hard to recommend to you because you've seen all my recommendations on TikTok. I'm really excited for I think you've read it, Paul by Daisy LaFar.
I have not read it yet, but it's on my list. I think it comes out, is it tomorrow or
Oh,
something?
oh,
And
maybe
so,
tomorrow. It's Tuesday. Maybe tomorrow. I'm so excited for that one. That cover is beautiful.
yeah, I'm so stoked for that. I will definitely be reading that one. Another Riverhead books with the stunning covers. I mean, these are both Riverhead books. So good. Yeah, they show really well on social media as well, which helps. Yeah, I mean, there's so many books. It's been hard, like, keeping up and being an influencer in the last, like, 2-ish years, trying to keep up with new stuff as well, because there's so much I'm so eager about. Getting to, hear what other authors are excited about has been really exciting to wade through all that and figure out what I want to read. But I'm wondering, who influences you to pick up books?
Oh, I don't. Okay, so I guess this is the truth, and I haven't thought about this until now. But when I was in my MFA program, I had this professor, Rob Spillman, who he would have us pass in our work, but we could only pass in the first 300 words, and it could not exceed a page. And he was like, "You have to pass the 300 word test." The class was called Establishing Authority. Basically, the exercise was like if you go into a bookstore, if you should know within the first 300 words whether or not you want to read. I'm not answering your question at all, but basically this has influenced me in such a strong way because I go into the bookstore, I read the first 300 words, and if I don't like it, I don't pick it up, which maybe that's mean to the books. But other than that, I guess TikTok influences me. I'm so immersed in the literary world that it's like it's always in my face. I can't even pinpoint who it is that's recommending these books. Who influences you?
I would say authors that I love, I tend to go to them like on social media or just look up like Sheila Heti, like I mentioned before. I love her books. And so I found like her top 10 lists and I picked up The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I had read back in like high school, but I hadn't revisited since then and I loved it again. So that was just one thing. But also blurbs on the back of books, I use them a lot too.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I feel like I have certain authors that like if they blurb something I like know I'll very likely enjoy it.
That is something that I do. I will go to an author's, wow, it's so 2022, but I'll go to their social media page to see what they're reading. But yeah, I feel like I'm constantly being influenced by books. It's a problem. I mean, you probably have the same. I have so many books in this place that I have not read. I also feel like I'm consuming them so fast that there are times when I don't remember what I just read, which is scary. I think I need to slow down a little bit.
Thank you so much for the recommendations and the lovely chat. I've been so stoked for this for so long now. So
Me too. Me too, truly.
thank you so much for joining me and everyone watching this. I will leave a link below to purchase the book. Please do. Please read it. It's so excellent. It's also, I love small hardcovers. It looks great on shelves.
I love that it's so small.
Yeah, it's ideal. Riverhead Books really does a good job with everything regarding their books, but I love how they appear as well. But the content matches the appearance, I would say. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Kayla.
Thank you so much.